The rain came down the way it always did in Contra, sudden, violent, and without apology. It flattened the dust, turned the red earth into blood-colored mud, and swallowed sound until even the artillery felt distant, like thunder remembered from another life. James Carter lay half-conscious behind a limestone outcrop, his medic bag torn open, morphine vials gone, radio crushed beneath a boot that no longer moved. He was 24, a U.S. Army combat medic, and the last thing he clearly remembered was the order to pull back now, and the rotor wash of helicopters lifting others out while the tree line erupted in orange light. Then silence. Not peace. Just the kind of silence that waits. His leg burned where shrapnel had torn it open. He pressed down with shaking hands, counting breaths the way they taught him back home in Virginia, when panic threatened to steal air from his lungs. In, out, don't scream, don't pray, stay useful. A shadow crossed the mouth of the cave. James reached for a weapon that wasn't there. Hush, a voice male low, Vietnamese accented English shaped carefully, like glass handled with bare fingers. If you move, you die. She stepped into the thin light. North Vietnamese Army fatigues. A Red Cross armband darkened with rain. Her hair was tied back, face streaked with mud and soot, eyes steady in a way that told him she had already seen too much to be afraid now. She crouched beside him, hands already working, cleaning, tying, pressing. Professional, efficient. I'm a medic, James whispered, because identity felt like the last thing he owned. So am I, she said. My name is Han. Outside, the war found its voice again, machine gun fire snapping like dry branches, the hollow thud of mortars. The cave shuddered. Dust fell like ash. They waited. Time inside the cave didn't move forward. It circled. James drifted in and out, waking to the taste of salt as Han broke a piece of her ration and pressed it to his lips. He chewed slowly, embarrassed by his weakness, grateful beyond words. You should leave, he said at some point. They'll come. For me. And shook her head. Not yet. The rain hides us. In the half-light, they spoke in fragment where they were from, how long they'd been in the field. James told her about patching bows, no older than his kid brother, about learning to keep his hands steady while his heart did everything but, and spoke of carrying wounded men through jungle paths at night, of stitching by flashlight, of promises made to families she might never see again. They did not speak of politics, or sides, or blame. When the sound of rotors cut through the rain, James knew before he heard it fully. Rescue had a sound. Hope always did, and helped him stand. Outside, smoke drifted low. The clearing ahead was Cowsmid shouting, hands reaching. He pulled the compass from his neck before fear could stop him. It was dented, old even then, a thing that had pointed north through places no map wanted to remember. Take this, he said, pressing it into her palm. If I don't make it, it'll still know the way. And closed her fingers around it. For the first time, her composure cracked. You live, she said. Not a plea, a command. The helicopter lifted James away. Wind tore at the world. He saw her once more below, hand raised, rain washing the blood from her sleeve. Then she was gone. Years later, James would wake to that sound, rotors, the rain, the voice telling him not to move and reach for a compass that was no longer there, still pointing him somewhere he didn't yet understand. In Virginia, the war didn't end with a parade. It ended in small, quiet ways, like James Carter standing in a grocery aisle years later, staring at a shelf of canned soup while his hands began to tremble for no reason he could explain to anyone watching. He came home with the kind of smile that fooled neighbors. He shook hands. He said the right things. He let his mother touch his face like she was confirming he was real. And when people asked him what it had been like, he gave them sentences that sounded tidy. Hot, rough, glad it's over. But at night, his body told the truth. The rain in Virginia could turn a roof into a drum, and every storm dragged Contra back into the bedroom. His wife, Ellen, learned to wake gently, hand on his shoulder, voice soft, patient as a nurse. James, it's me, you're safe. Sometimes he would sit straight up, eyes wide, as if the ceiling were the mouth of a cave. Sometimes he would claw for a medic bag that wasn't there. The worst nights were the ones when he didn't wake fully, when he stayed half inside the old world and spoke names that Ellen had never heard. And he would whisper, like a confession. One evening in 1978, Ellen found him in the garage, sitting on the concrete floor with a small metal box open in his lap. Inside were a few items he never showed anyone: a faded unit patch, a pair of dog tags he'd promised to deliver, but never could, a blood-stained field dressing folded small as a secret. Ellen crouched beside him. You've kept all this? James shut the box, ashamed like a child caught stealing. It's not trophies, he said quickly. It's proof that it happened. Ellen didn't argue. She simply rested her hand on the closed lid. Then keep it, she said. But don't let it keep you. He tried. He truly tried. He worked as an EMT. The irony wasn't lost on him that the only place he felt steady was inside an ambulance, sirens screaming, hands busy, life hanging by a thread he could actually hold. In emergencies, he became the man he remembered liking, focused, useful, calm. In quiet rooms, he was a stranger to himself. Across the ocean, in Vietnam, the silence took a different shape. He returned from the field with mud still in the seams of her uniform, and the compass heavy against her chest. She didn't wear it openly at first. It felt dangerous proof of a moment that didn't fit the clean categories the world demanded. But she couldn't put it away either. It lay under her blouse like a second heartbeat. After 1975, the country rearranged itself. New rules, new faces in offices, ration lines, long mornings with empty stomachs and stubborn resolve, and went back to school. She studied medicine with the ferocity of someone who had seen what a lack of skill could cost. Her classmates knew her as disciplined, sharp-tongued when needed, and strangely gentle with patients others dismissed. She never bragged, never chased attention. When asked why she worked so hard, she said only, because people don't get a second chance in war. In private, she opened the compass and watched the needle settle. North, always north, steady as truth. Sometimes, late at night, she imagined the young American medic's faces shed last seen it blurred by rain and rotor wash. She did not know his full name. She had heard James and something else swallowed by nose. She had no address, no photograph, no proof besides the compass and the memory of his voice. She told no one. In Vietnamese culture, she had learned, a promise could be spoken without words. A vow could live inside you, quiet and absolute. Her mother began to hint about marriage. A neighbor introduced a kind man who worked in a ministry. Another offered a cousin with stable income and gentle manners. He refused them all, politely at first, then firmly. Her mother's patience thinned with the years. One night, over a simple meal, she set down her chopsticks and said, "Con, you cannot marry a memory," and stared at the steam rising from the rice, and for a moment, she saw mist rolling into a cave. "It's not a memory," she said. "It's a life I owe." Her mother softened. "Then repay it by living." But she did not take off the compass. In the late 1980s, James watched news footage of Vietnam on a flickering TV, images of cities rebuilding, farmers in conical hats, children running beside bicycles. It looked peaceful, and that peace made him uncomfortable, like walking into a church after years of no's. One night, he finally told Ellen the story he'd never spoken aloud. He did it slowly in fragments, as if naming it too clearly might summon it. "A nurse," he said, "North Vietnamese. She found me, saved me." Ellen listened, eyes steady. "Did you ever find her?" James stared at the floor. "I didn't even know her last name." Ellen reached for his hand. "Then you carry her," she said quietly, "like she carried you." Time moved on, jobs, small routines, birthdays that came and went. But the war remained, stitched into both of them in different languages. And though they lived on opposite sides of the planet, both James and Anne kept their relics closely with his sealed metal box. She with the compass at her throat, each of them guided by an invisible thread that neither dared to tug too hard. Not yet, because sometimes hope is not a bright thing. Sometimes hope is simply what you refuse to bury. In 1995, the world shifted with the quiet click of a door unlocking. James heard it on the radio first, some announcer talking about diplomats, embassies, normalization, the careful language of governments trying to turn a page without admitting how much blood had soaked the paper. He was in his kitchen, rinsing a coffee mug, when the words United States and Vietnam made his shoulders tighten as if someone had called his name from across a battlefield. He turned the volume up. Normalization. A new chapter. Healing. Trade. Visas. The mug slipped in his hands and clinked against the sink. A harmless sound, yet his heart kicked hard, as if metal had struck stone inside a cave. Across the ocean, and read the same news in a Vietnamese newspaper, whose ink smudged slightly on her fingertips. She was no longer the thin, mud-streaked nurse from Quang Tri. She was a doctor, now white coat, hair neatly pinned, the authority of skill in her voice. But when she saw the headline, her breath caught in the same place it had in 1972. She went into her small office and locked the door. Then she opened her blouse collar and held the compass in her palm like a prayer. The needle trembled just slightly before settling north. and sat down and took out a sheet of paper so clean it felt almost foreign. For years, she had carried the story in her body, told only in silence, in the way she worked, in the way she refused marriage proposals and kept moving forward as if she were still leading someone out of danger. Now there was a path, thin as a thread, the Red Cross. People spoke of it like a Bridgian organization that had helped families search for the missing, reunite scattered kin, find names that wars tried to erase. It wasn't magic, but it was something real, something recognized and wrote carefully in English, her pen pausing as she weighed each word. To whom it may concern, I am seeking information about an American combat medic named James. He was in Contra Province in 1972. He was injured and evacuated by helicopter. I am a Vietnamese nurse who treated him. Please advise if you can help identify him. She read it 3 times, then added the only detail she truly had, James Medic Contra 1972. It looked pitiful on paper, like trying to catch a river with a teacup. Still, she folded the letter neatly and placed it in an envelope. Her hands, usually steady, trembled as she sealed it. She mailed it the next morning before the sun fully rose, as if daylight might make her doubt herself. Weeks passed, then months. One afternoon, a response arrived. Official letterhead, polite phrasing, a stamp that made her heart jump. She tore it open with the care of a surgeon and the desperation of a woman who had been waiting half her life. The message was short. Information provided is insufficient to positively identify the individual. Please submit additional details if available. And stared at the words until they blurred. Her throat tightened. Not anger, something older. The exhaustion of pushing against a wall that did not move. She folded the letter and placed it beside the compass. Then, because she had always been the kind of person who kept going even when hope was thin, she wrote again and again, to different branches, different offices. She reached out through every channel she could find, always with the same sparse details. Sometimes there was no reply at all. Sometimes there was another version of the same sentence, not enough. In Virginia, James was not writing letters. He was simply trying to survive his own mind. By 1995, his marriage had weathered years of invisible storms. Ellen had learned when to touch him and when to leave him alone. James had learned how to smile at neighbors, how to keep his nightmares private, how to swallow the sharp edges of memory so no one else had to cut their hands on them. Yet when he heard about normalization, something restless woke inside him. He went to the garage at night and pulled down the metal box. The lid squeaked, a sound so small it felt sinful. He sat on an overturned bucket and stared at the items inside patch, dog tags, field dressing, a photograph of his unit that had faded into ghosts. Ellen appeared in the doorway, robe pulled close against the chill. You're thinking again, she said gently. James didn't look up. It's opening, he murmured. Vietnam. It's opening. Ellen stepped closer. Do you want to go? The question hit him like a flare in darkness. Want. As if wanting were simple. He swallowed. I don't know what I want. Ellen's voice softened. Do you want to find her? James' hand tightened around the edge of the box. He could see Anne's face in the cave, the way she pressed food to his lips, the way she said you live like she could command the universe. I don't even know her last name, he said, the old shame rising again. Ellen crouched beside him, eyes kind but firm. Then start with what you know. He shook his head slowly. What I know is a memory. And what she knows, Ellen said, might be the same. That night, James sat at the kitchen table with a blank sheet of paper, pen hovering over it. He wrote Dear Sir or Madam and stopped. His heart raced. He could patch a wound in a moving ambulance, but this felt like stepping back into the jungle without a map. He crumpled the paper and threw it away. He told himself it was too late, that it would only stir pain, that the past should stay sealed. But in the weeks that followed, he found himself listening to the radio reports again and again, as if the world might suddenly offer him a name and address, a sign. He didn't know that in Vietnam, a woman with a compass had already begun sending her voice across the ocean in envelopes. He didn't know that her letters were stacking up like small lanterns in the dark, each one refusing to go out. And he didn't know, yet, that a search could last 30 years, not because the heart is foolish, but because the heart remembers what the world forgets. By the early 2000s, Vietnam was moving fast, new buildings rising like confident shoulders, streets filling with motorbikes, young people speaking about the future with a kind of hunger that had nothing to do with ration lines. In Ho Chi Minh City, the air smelled of exhaust and sweet coffee, and in the mornings, sunlight struck glass towers that hadn't existed when Anne was crawling through mud with a first aid kit. and watched all of it with a steady, practical eye. She had spent years in public hospitals where the corridors were crowded and the equipment was always one step behind what the patients deserved. She treated children with infections that could have been prevented, elderly men who apologized for being sick, mothers who handed over wrinkled bills like they were offering pieces of their own bodies. One day, after a long shift, she stood by a window and saw her reflection, gray starting to thread through her hair, lines forming at the corners of her eyes. She looked older than she felt, or maybe she felt older than she admitted. She touched the compass under her collar. It was still there, still heavy, still faithful. That same week, she walked into a small office, nothing fancy, just a desk, two chairs, a ceiling fan that clicked as it turned and told a young businessman she wanted to start a pharmaceutical company. He blinked at her. Doctor in business is not like medicine. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. In medicine, if you hesitate, someone dies, she said. So I do not hesitate. She began with one product, then two. She leveraged every connection she had. She partnered, negotiated, refused to be patronized. When a man tried to explain finance to her as if she were a child, she waited until he finished and then corrected his numbers without looking at her notes. She worked like someone who had already survived the worst thing life could do. Soon her company grew steady at first, then suddenly, she became a woman with a driver, a woman whose name appeared in trade magazines, a woman who walked into meetings and made people stand up without ever demanding it. And still, she wrote letters. Sometimes, in the quiet between flights and boardrooms, she would open her laptop and search online. Early internet connections in Vietnam were slow and fickle, but she used them anyway, typing the same keywords like an incantation. James Medicontra 1972. Nothing. Or worse than was. Hundreds of irrelevant results. A vast ocean of information that somehow did not hold the one thing she wanted. She told herself the search was not her whole life. But at night, when the city lights glittered outside her window like distant flares, she held the compass and imagined the needle pointing to a man somewhere older now, perhaps gray-haired, perhaps alone, still alive. Across the Pacific, James Carter's world was shrinking. By 2003, the ambulance sirens that once anchored him had faded into a past he couldn't return to. His wife, Ellen, had grown thin over the years, thin in the way grief makes people, even before grief has a name. She developed a quiet illness that moved through her body like an unwelcome guest. James became her caretaker, then her witness, then, finally, her widower. The day she died, he stood in their living room, staring at the indentation her body had left in the couch cushion, and felt something break inside him that had already been cracked for decades. There were no children to fill the house with no's, no grandchildren to demand he keep going. Friends offered casseroles and condolences and then, inevitably, returned to their own lives. James didn't blame them. He simply became invisible. His PTSD, which had always lurked like a shadow, now stepped fully into the light. He stopped answering calls, stopped attending veteran gatherings, stopped going to church. The world felt loud and sharp, filled with sudden sounds that made his heart sprint. Sometimes he sat in his garage with the metal box on his lap, running his fingers over the old unit patch until his fingertips went numb. On bad nets, he drank too much. On worse nets, he didn't drink at all because he needed to stay alert, as if the war might come back for him personally. In 2006, he finally tried the internet. A neighbor helped him set up an email account. The computer made him nervous, too much light, too many pop-ups, too many things that appeared without warning. But he typed anyway, stiff and slow, searching for Vietnam Nurse 1972 and Quang Tri Medic saved and anything that sounded like the cave. A week later, an email arrived. The subject line, "I can help you find her." James stared at it for a long time, pulse thickening in his throat. His hands shook as he clicked. The message was friendly, confident, filled with details that felt almost too perfect. The sender claimed to have contacts in Vietnam, access to records and network of veterans. All they needed was a fee. James hesitated. He should have recognized it, should have seen the hungry angle behind the kindness. But grief makes people reach for ropes even when they are afraid. He sent money, then more, then a final amount that left his checking account bruised. After that, the messages stopped. The email address disappeared as if it had never existed. James sat at the kitchen table with the computer screen glowing coldly in front of him, feeling foolish in a way that hurt more than anger. He wasn't just robbed of money. He was robbed of the fragile hope he'd barely allowed himself to touch. He slammed the laptop shut and whispered, "Of course, to an empty room. As the years pushed forward and rose higher, more successful, more powerful, while James drifted lower, quieter, reduced to a man who moved through days like he was apologizing for taking up space, to lives shaped by the same night encounter, now pulling in opposite directions. Yet the thread between them did not break. It merely stretched across decades, across oceans, holding steady in silence, waiting for the moment when the world would finally stop getting in the way. In 2012, and stepped onto American soil for the first time with a passport full of stamps and a mind full of careful plans. She told herself it was a business trip. That was the clean version, one she could offer to colleagues, to investors, to the driver waiting outside an airport. She wore a tailored suit, carried a leather folder, and spoke into her phone with the calm authority of a woman who had negotiated contracts worth more than most people's houses. But under her blouse, the compass lay against her skin, warm from her body, stubborn as ever. In the air, somewhere above the Pacific, stared out a small oval window at a sky that looked endless and bland. Clouds spread beneath the plane like soft fields, as if the world had been made clean again. She closed her eyes and tried to imagine the young James being lifted into the air in 1972, the helicopter ripping him away from the jungle. This plane was quite civilized. The stewardess offered tea. The seatbelt sign chimed politely. No one screamed. No one bled. And still, Anne's heart beat like she was running. When she arrived in Chicago, OHR International, a city within a city, everything felt enormous. The ceilings were high enough to swallow sound. The halls moved like rivers of people. The English around her had a speed and casualness that made her concentrate hard to catch meaning. She was 62, successful, composed. Yet standing there under fluorescent lights, she felt suddenly young again, small in a world too big, too far from home. The private investigator met her near baggage claim. His name was Mark, a middle-aged man with a suit that didn't quite fit, and a gaze that slid around the crowd like he was always counting exits. He shook her hand. "Dr. Tran? Glad you made it," he said, pronouncing her name with effort. "I've got something." His breath snagged. "You found him?" Mark lifted a folder. "We found a James, Ohio. Age matches roughly. Army service charter to confirm from public records. But it's a promising lead." Promising. The word struck her like a spark. They sat in a small cafe that smelled of coffee and burnt pastry. Mark opened the folder and slid a photocopied page toward here, a name and address, a grainy photograph from a driver's license database, and stared at the face, a man with a rounded jaw, cheerful eyes, a smile too carefree. Not him, her instincts whispered immediately. Not the eyes she remembered. Not the haunted steadiness of a medic who had seen bodies torn open and still kept his hands from shaking. But instinct was not evidence. And for 37 years, she had survived on almost nothing. Mark spoke carefully. "Public records are messy. People change. But I think it's worth meeting him." He nodded. Her voice came out quiet. "I will go." 2 hours later, she was in another plainsmoor, this time, the kind that shuddered slightly with turbulence. She held the compass in her fist like a talisman. In her mind, she rehearsed the moment. She would stand in front of him, a gray-haired Vietnamese woman, and say one word, "James," and he would look up, and something in him would recognize her. Hope does not arrive politely. It storms in and rearranges everything. In Ohio, the air was colder. The sky hung low and pale. Mark drove her to a modest house in a quiet neighborhood lined with bare trees. His pulse hammered so loudly she could barely hear the car engine. Mark parked. "You ready?" Its mouth was dry. "Yes." They walked up the driveway. Mark rang the bell. A man opened the door, late 50s, heavier set, wearing a t-shirt with a sports logo. His face held no flicker of recognition, only mild irritation at being disturbed. "Yeah?" he said. Mark cleared his throat. "Mr. James," the man interrupted. "James Miller. What's this about?" And stepped forward, searching his eyes for anything familiar. There was nothing. No shadow of contour. No held breath, no tremor, no sudden silence. Still, she tried. Her voice softened as if speaking gently might coax the truth out. "Were you in Vietnam?" "In 1972. Combat medic?" James Miller blinked, then laughed once, short and sharp. "Lady, I was in high school in 72. The words fell like a stone, and felt her spine go rigid, as if her body refused to collapse even when her heart did. "I'm sorry," Mark said, quickly, embarrassed. "Records can be confusing." James Miller's expression shifted, irritation turning to suspicion. "You people selling something?" "No," and said, the English suddenly heavy in her mouth. "No, thank you." She turned before her composure could fully fracture. Back in the car, Mark spoke too fast, trying to patch the moment like a mistake in a business meeting. I'm sorry, Dr. Tran. It was a lead. We can keep searching. And stared out the window as houses slid by, identical and endless. How many, James? She asked quietly. Mark hesitated. Thousands. The answer was not cruel. It was simply the truth. At OHR that evening, she stood in the middle of the terminal with her suitcase at her side, and the folder pressed uselessly against her chest. People hurried past her, families laughing, couples arguing about gates, business travelers checking watches. Life moving forward with no awareness of the woman whose world was shattering in slow motion. The fluorescent lights made everything feel sterile and real. Mark spoke again, gentler now. Dr. Tran, you can go home. Well, keep working. We'll call you when there's another lead. Nodded as if she understood, as if she were still a woman in control. Then Mark walked away, and did the one thing she had not allowed herself to do for decades. She sat down on a cold metal bench near a window overlooking the runways, and she cried silently at first, then with quiet sobs that shook her shoulders. Not the dramatic kind of crying that draws attention, the kind of crying that happens when a person finally meets the size of her own loneliness. She pressed her hand to her chest, feeling the compass through the fabric. Its metal was steady, its needle unmoved. It did not point her to James. It only reminded her that direction and destination are not the same. Outside, planes lifted into the gray sky, one after another, carrying strangers toward reunions, toward homecomings, toward ordinary futures. And watched them and thought, with a bitter tenderness, America is so big that a man could vanish inside it, so big that a promise could wander for 50 years without finding its answer. When her boarding group was called, and stood up, wiped her cheeks carefully, and fixed her posture, she walked toward the gate like a woman going to a meeting. But inside, something had crackheaded in that crack. A new kind of determination began to form. Because if the world was vast, then she would become vaster. And she would not let the compass be the only thing that remembered. By 2018, understood something she hadn't fully grasped in 2012. Searching for one man in America was not a matter of luck. It was a matter of access. Access to time, to documents, to people who didn't answer strangers, to networks that only opened their doors when you could prove you belonged inside the room. She had monies, but money alone didn't unlock the right archives. It didn't give her the right to stay long enough to follow a lead to its end. It didn't grant her the quiet persistence of being present. So she made a decision that looked purely strategic from the outside and purely personal from the inside. EB5, an investor visa, a legitimate path, tangled in paperwork and scrutiny. She sat in sleek offices with immigration attorneys, listened to them explain quotas and timelines, job creation requirements and compliance, and nodded as if she were discussing a merger. But when she returned to her hotel at night, she took out the compass and held it in both hands, whispering to it like it was a living thing. Give me one more chance, she said softly. Let me stay long enough. The application process was exhausting. It demanded transparency, proof, patience things war had already forced her to master, but in a different form. She submitted business plans, bank statements, tax records. She opened a U.S. branch of her company with the kind of careful structure that would survive audits. She hired Americans. She built something that, on paper, was about commerce. In truth, she was building a bridge to one person. When the visa was approved, she didn't celebrate with champagne. She sat alone in her hotel room, the approval notice on the bedspread, and cried again, this time without breaking. This time, her tears felt like fuel. She moved through the United States like someone reading a vast book with missing chapters. Airports became familiar. Rental cars, motel rooms with the same beige lamps, and the same clean smell of detergent. She learned how Americans spoke when they were being polite, but not helpful. She learned how to listen for what wasn't said. Her assistant efficient, Vietnamese American kept spreadsheets of leads, names, places, units, reunion dates, Facebook groups, VFW halls, VA offices that required permissions and forms and still offered little. And CI, the assistant said one evening in a small apartment they rented near Arlington, maybe he doesn't want to be found. And looked up sharply, not angry, just focused. If he doesn't want to be found, she said, I will still know I tried. She began attending every veterans gathering she could. Some were formal, with flags and crisp speeches. Others were messy, loud, held in bar backrooms where old men laughed to heart and drank to fast, as if joy could etch out memory. At her first Vietnam Veterans of America parade, she stood among a sea of jackets embroidered with unit patches and years of service. The air smelled of leather and cheap cologne. The men walked with a stiffness that wasn't always age. Some had injuries you could see, others had injuries you couldn't, and held a restored photograph in her hands. James in his 20s, a young medic's face half shadowed under a helmet. She had paid to have it professionally enhanced from an old still image of veteran contact, had found in a unit newsletter, grainy but usable. She approached an elderly man in a faded cap. "Excuse me," she said gently. "Do you know this man?" The man squinted, then shook his head. "Sorry, Mom." She tried another, then another. Most were kind, some were suspicious. A few were openly hostile, still trapped in old anger, still unable to imagine that a Vietnamese woman could carry anything but blame. One man snapped, "Why you looking for him?" "To finish the job." The words hit him like a slap, but she didn't flinch. She kept her voice calm. "To say thank you," she said, "and to be at peace." The man stared, confused by her steadiness, and looked away. Afterward, in the quiet of her car, her assistant asked, "Sien King?" His eyes stayed on the road. "In war," she said softly, "people say cruel things because they are afraid of what they remember." Meanwhile, in Virginia, James was still there, still breathing, still aging, still drifting farther from the world. He lived in the same house he and Ellen had bought decades ago, but it no longer felt like a home. It felt like a museum of a life that had ended. The walls held photographs of two people smiling in earlier years. Dust gathered in corners he stopped noticing. His PTSD wasn't dramatic. It was persistent. It was the way a passing helicopter made his throat tighten. The way fireworks on the 4th of July turned his neighborhood into a minefield of sound. The way he always sat with his back to a wall in diners, as tracking exits without thinking. He didn't attend veteran reunions. The idea of standing in a crowd of men who all carried the same darkness felt unbearable. Yet sometimes, late at night, he opened his metal box again. He would hold the unit patch between his fingers and think not of the war in general, but of one specific moment, the cave, the rain, the Vietnamese nurse whose eyes never wavered. He never spoke her name aloud anymore. It felt dangerous, like calling something back from the dead. In 2018, he received a call from a VA outreach worker. "Mr. Carter, we've got a group session for Vietnam vets. Trauma support. Might help." James stared at the phone like it was a grenade. "I'm fine," he said and hung up. Afterward, he sat very still, feeling his chest tighten with the old familiar panic, the kind that didn't need a reason. Because the truth was, he wasn't fine. He was surviving. And survival, he had learned, could last a very long time, especially when you didn't believe you deserved anything else. Back on the road, he kept going. She crossed states like chapters. She stood in community halls and listened to men tell stories they had never told their own children. She learned the language of American veterans' gallows humor, the sudden silences, the way buddy could mean brother and ghost at the same time. One evening, after another fruitless parade, she returned to her apartment and loosened the chain around her neck. The compass fell into her palm. She stared at it until her eyes blurred, then whispered, not as a demand this time, but as a promise. "I am still here," she said. "I will not stop." Outside, America hummed traffic, distant sirens, a country moving forward. And in that moving world, somewhere behind a closed door in Virginia, an old medic sat alone with a metal box, unaware that a woman with a compass had finally gained the right to stay long enough to find him. Not by luck, but by a stubborn heart that refused to accept silence as an ending. In 2024, the body becomes a kind of witness. It keeps score in ways pride can't negotiate, with shortness of breath that arrives too easily, joints that ache before weather changes, fatigue that doesn't lift with sleep. For James Carter, illness came the way so many things in his life had come, quietly at first, then all at once, like a door finally giving way. He told himself it was nothing. Age, stress, a stubborn cold. But one afternoon, carrying groceries from the trunk to the kitchen, his vision narrowed. The world tilted. He grabbed the counter, but his hands didn't obey the way they used to. He slid to the floor, forehead pressed to the cabinet door, listening to his own breathing turn thin and panicked. In the old days, he would have treated a patient like this. Now he was the patient. A neighbor found him when the dog barked too long. An ambulance committed irony, almost cruel enough to be funny. The paramedics spoke to him the way he used to speak to others, calm and practiced. "Sir, can you tell me your name? Can you squeeze my hand?" James tried to answer, but his throat tightened. He felt a sudden shame, not because he was weak, but because he was alone. At the VA hospital, the fluorescent lights had the same cold honesty as every institution. The staff were competent, compassionate in a way that came from having seen too much. A nurse adjusted his blanket. A doctor asked questions. A social worker took notes. "What support do you have at home?" she asked. James stared at the ceiling tiles. "No one," he said simply. Saying it out loud made it real. The diagnosis was complicated enough that James stopped trying to translate it into normal language. He only understood the practical outcome: frequent visits, medications, the slow unwinding of independence. The hospital offered assistance programs, but there were gaps, always gaps. He had savings, but not endless ones. And he had a house full of old things that suddenly looked like money trapped in object form. So he did what many proud men do when they are cornered by reality. He started selling pieces of his past. Not the sentimental things at first, not the metal box. He began with furniture he didn't use, tools he no longer trusted his hands to handle. He posted items online. A man came for the old lawnmower. A couple bought his spare TV. Each exchange left his home emptier, and somehow, the air inside it grew lighter. Then, one day, he opened a closet he rarely touched and found a cardboard box filled with memorabilia from the war, an old poncho liner, a battered canteen cup, faded photographs, and underneath it all, the small metal box with a scuffed lid. He sat on the edge of the bed and held it for a long time. This box had survived his marriage, his widow, his years of shutting doors inside himself. It had been his private proof, his sealed witness, the one place he allowed the past to exist. His thumb traced the lid's edge. A thought rose unwanted, but persistent: if I die, who will know what this meant? He nearly laughed at the absurdity. Who would care? But the question wouldn't leave him. That night, he opened it. The contents looked smaller than he remembered, like the objects had shrunk under the weight of decades. The unit patch, the dog tags he'd never delivered, the folded field dressing, a few letters Ellen had written him when he was overseas, her handwriting looping like a soft hand reaching through time. And beneath those, taped to the bottom, a worn scrap of paper with a unit designation and a partially faded roster he had once copied from a bulletin board: names, nicknames, fragments of the life he used to have. James stared at it, feeling that old ache in his chest, one that wasn't medical. He closed the box with a decisive click. 2 weeks later, he drove slowly, careful to a small antique and resale shop tucked off a side road in Virginia. It smelled of dust, old wood, and the faint sweetness of furniture polish. The owner, a woman in her 60s with bright eyes and a practical smile, looked up as James carried items in. "Anything special today?" she asked. "Just old things," James replied. He placed a few items on the counter. The owner examined them with casual interest. When James hesitated, still holding the metal box, she noticed. "That one means something?" she asked gently. James' jaw tightened. "It's just war stuff." She nodded like she understood the language of men who didn't want to feel. "I can give you a fair price," she said, not pushing. James looked down at the box. In that moment, he felt as if he were handing over his last tether to a world that had already taken so much. But the hospital bills sat in his mind like a pressure he couldn't ignore. He slid the box across the counter. "Fine," he said, voice flat. "Take it." The owner wrapped it in brown paper with practiced hands. "You sure?" she asked one more time, as kind. James didn't trust himself to answer honestly. He simply nodded and took the cash. When he walked out, the air outside felt sharper. He sat in his car for a long time before starting the engine, hands on the steering wheel, eyes unfocused. He told himself it was necessary. He did not tell himself it felt like betrayal. Months passed. The box sat in the shop, unnoticed among lamps and costume jewelry and old baseball gloves. To most customers, it was nothing, just a relic of a war that belonged to documentaries and distant headlines. Then, on a bright afternoon, a young man walked in, Vietnamese American, neatly dressed, carrying a list on his phone. He wasn't browsing for fun. He moved with purpose. His name was Min, and he worked for Hanit as a simple assistant, but as a kind of quiet extension of her will. After years of dead ends, had built a small team in the U.S. to search full-time. Min's job was to follow faint trails most people would dismiss: veteran estate sales, thrift stores near VA facilities, swap meets where old men's lives were sold table by table. Min spoke politely to the shop owner. "I'm looking for Vietnam War memorabilia," he said. "Medical units especially." The owner's eyebrows lifted. Funny you ask. I've got a box that came in recently. Military, medic type stuff. She reached under the counter and pulled out the wrapped bundle. When she opened it, Min felt his stomach tighten it from emotion, but from that sudden instinct that says pay attention. Inside, among patches and papers, he saw something that made his breath catch. A roster fragment, a unit designation, and a name written in a careful hand, James Carter. Min's fingers hovered above it, almost afraid to touch. He lifted the paper gently, as if it might crumble. Underneath, taped to the bottom of the box, was a faded note with a few words that looked like a clue left behind without meaning to. Puncture 1970 to cave nurse named him. Min's throat went dry. For a moment, the shop nose disappeared. The clink of a bell, the hum of an air conditioner, the world narrowed to ink on paper, and the weight of what it implied. He pulled out his phone and stepped outside into the sunlight, hands trembling as he dialed. When in answer, her voice was calm until she heard his first sentence. Min said, barely able to keep his voice steady. I think we found him. On the other end of the line, there was a silence so deep it sounded like the air itself had stopped. Then, softly, almost not a voice at all, and whispered, read me the name. And when Min said it, the compass at his throat, half a world away, seemed for the first time in decades to grow suddenly heavier, as if it had been waiting for this exact moment to become real again. By the time autumn arrived in 2026, had stopped calling it a search. Not out loud, anyway. To Min, to the attorneys, to the small team she paid to track records and phone numbers, she spoke in practical language, appointments, files, schedules. She became the businesswoman again, the woman who could walk into a room and make decisions with a calm face. But inside herself, something had changed after the call in 2024. A name on paper was not a reunion. A clue was not a life. America still had a way of swallowing people, especially men like James Min, who learned to disappear to survive. And yet, once the threat had been found, could not pretend it didn't exist. Still, she made a choice that surprised even Min. On November 11th, Veterans Day, she would go to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., not to find James, to face what she had been carrying, to walk, finally, into the place where the war was carved into stone, where grief was not a private sickness, but a public language, to offer a farewell if that was what the world demanded, to thank the dead, to forgive the living, to let the compass rest if it would. Min tried to speak carefully. See if we have his name. We can go to Virginia first. We can, and lifted a hand. Not harsh, just final. I know, she said, but I need to go there, before anything else. So on a morning, when the air felt like clean glass, cold enough to sting, not cold enough to wound, and stood at her hotel window and watched Washington wake up. The trees along the avenues had turned gold and rust. The wind shook leaves loose, and they drifted downward like slow-burning embers. She dressed with the quiet dignity of an older woman who had lived through scarcity, war, success, and solitude. A dark coat, sensible shoes, a scarf wrapped neatly at her throat. The compass lay beneath it, pressed against her sternum. When she arrived at the memorial, she did not rush. She approached the way one approaches a grave, slow, respectful, braced for the sudden hit of emotion that can ambush even the strongest person. The walkway slipped gently downward, leading her into the earth, into the black stone that cut through the landscape like a wound that had refused to close. Tourists and veterans moved quietly, voices softened without anyone needing to be told. The wall was not loud. It did not shout its story. It simply was a long stretch of polished black granite, reflecting faces and sky and trees. Names carved in precise rows, over 58,000 of them, each one a life that had ended far from home. The letters looked small until you stood close enough to feel their weight, and stopped at the edge and placed her palm against the stone. It was colder than she expected. The chill traveled through her skin, through her bones, and for an instant she was back in 1972, hands bloody, kneeling in wet earth, trying to keep a stranger alive. She watched others. An old man in a faded jacket traced a name with 2 fingers, and then pressed his forehead to the wall as if listening for a voice. A woman in her 70s held a photograph against the stone, her lips moving in a whisper only she could hear. A teenage boy, perhaps a grandson, stood awkwardly beside an elder, uncertain what grief required of him. His eyes filled, but she did not cry yet. She had learned long ago that tears were not weakness. They were simply the body's way of releasing what it could no longer hold. She took out a small piece of paper from her bag, thin, almost translucent. She had written down a name she'd been given only of James' unit mates, a man listed among the dead, someone who might have been in the same chaotic world James had inhabited. She knelt carefully, joints stiff with age, and smoothed the paper over the carved letters. With a crayon she brought specifically for this, she began to rub gently, letting the raised edges reveal themselves as dark lines. The act was simple, almost childlike, and yet it felt sacred. As she worked, she noticed her hand trembling knit from the cold alone, from the weight of time, from the knowledge that she had spent decades chasing one living man while thousands had never come home at all. She paused, breath fogging the air. A voice behind her spoke softly, American, older. You need help with that? He did not turn. Not yet. Her focus stayed on the paper, the name emerging like a ghost. I am fine, she said in careful English. The man did not push. He only stepped slightly away, giving her space the way people do at funerals. He finished the rubbing, lifted the paper, and stared at it. The name was there in charcoal sharp, undeniable, proof that someone had existed. She folded it carefully and slipped it back into her bag like a relic. Then she stood and began to walk along the wall, letting her eyes travel across the names. She wasn't looking for one person. She was letting the wall speak to her in its quiet, relentless way. Each name was a story that had ended too soon. Each name was a mother's sleepless night. Each name was a promise broken by distance and war. She reached a section where flowers had been laid, small flags, roses, handwritten notes tucked into the base. One note, written in shaky handwriting, said simply, "Still miss you every day," and felt her throat tighten. For a long time, she had told herself she wasn't searching out of love, that it was gratitude, that it was moral duty. But standing there, surrounded by names and reflections, she could no longer hide from the truth. What she carried for James had changed shape over the decades. It had matured. It had deepened. It had become something that resembled love, not the young, reckless kind, but the late, steady kind that asks for nothing except the chance to be real. The wind lifted her scarf slightly, brushing her collarbone. The compass pressed against her skin. She placed her fingers over it, eyes closing. Today, she whispered in Vietnamese, voice barely audible, I am here to say goodbye or to say thank you. Either way, she opened her eyes and looked at the wall again. In the polished granite, her reflection stared back on elderly Vietnamese woman with silver hair, a calm face, and eyes that held a whole century of storms. She did not know yet that a few steps away, the past was walking toward her with its own slow, careful feet, not as a young medic, as an old man, and not because the world had finally become kind, but because two lives, pulled apart by history, had been quietly, stubbornly moving toward the same place and carved name at a time. He returned to the same panel twice before she admitted the truth to herself. She wasn't lost. She was lingering. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial has a way of slowing time. People walk differently, Theralus hurried, more careful, like each step might disturb something sleeping beneath the ground. The wind slipped through the trees and brought the scent of fallen leaves, crisp and faintly sweet. Somewhere above the wall, traffic murmured like a distant river, reminding everyone that life kept moving even when hearts stopped. He knelt again, this time in front of a different Namad one man had found for her in an old database, a man who had served near the same place and time as James. She took out another thin sheet of paper, and as she positioned it, her fingers betrayed her. The tremor was subtle, but it was there. Age, cold, emotion, the accumulated weight of decades. She began rubbing the crayon gently. The letters appeared like dark bones beneath skin. Halfway through, her paper snagged on a slight ridge in the stone. The corner tore with a soft, humiliating sound, up so small it wouldn't have mattered anywhere else. Here it felt loud as a gunshot. Pin froze. Her breath caught. Her hands hovered over the torn sheet, suddenly helpless, like she'd failed an unseen test. A rush of frustration rose in her chest, not anger at the paper, but grief at her own body, at time itself. A younger Hen would have simply started again. The end of 2026 felt the sting of limits. Behind her, a step paused. Then, without a word, a hand entered her field of vision, male, older, skin weathered, nails clean. It offered a fresh sheet of thin white paper. You can use mine, the man said quietly. His voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. It carried the American softness of someone who had learned to speak gently, as if any sudden sound might shatter a room. And looked down at the paper first, then at the hand. Thank you, she said, her English careful, formal. She accepted it with both hands the way she'd been taught to receive something meaningful. She did not turn fully at first. Instead, she smoothed the new paper against the wall, trying to regain steadiness. Her fingers trembled again, less from cold now and more from something unnamed. I'm sorry, she murmured, almost to herself. No need, the man replied. It happens. He stood close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence, but not close enough to crowd her. That distance of respectful space felt strangely familiar, like the way medics stand near each other in tight places, ready to help without getting in the way, and began rubbing again. That's when she noticed the reflection. The wall's polished black surface held everything, trees, sky, passersby, and in it, beside her own face, a man's face appeared older, lined, pale beneath a cap. His eyes were fixed not on the names, not on her hands, but on the chain at her throat, on the pendant beneath her scarf, on the compass. Its fingers stopped moving. She lifted her head slightly, not turning her body, only her gaze. In the granite's dark mirror, she saw him more clearly. He wasn't tall. His shoulders slipped slightly, as if they carried an old weight. A jacket hung on him, one of those veteran jackets with embroidered patches and years stitched on the back. On his chest, pinned medals caught the daylight like small pieces of trapped sun. His eyes were the thing. They had the same steadiness she remembered from a cave, the look of someone who has seen blood and still refuses to look away from life. His mouth went dry. She swallowed, and the scarf at her throat shifted. The compass pendant slipped into clearer view against her coat. The man's breath hitched. His lips parted as if he'd forgotten how speech worked. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Round them, other visitors continued their slow pilgrim walk, unaware that history was folding in on itself only a few feet away, and turned her head slightly more, just enough to catch him directly in her peripheral vision. The man's gaze stayed locked on the compass. His hand lifted, trembling, as if he wanted to touch it but did not dare. That, he said, voice thin, almost broken. Where did you get that? His heart began to pound with such force, she could feel it in her wrists. Her mind tried to protect her. Don't assume. Don't hope to fast. Don't break yourself again. But the compass had been against her skin for half a century. She knew its every scratch, its dented edge, the way the glass caught light. It was given to me, she said softly. In Kungcher, 1972. The man's face drained of color. He took one step closer, careful, as if the ground might explode, and the metals on his chest shifted. Metal brushed metal with a faint clink. At the same instant, the compass needle lay hidden beneath its glass irked. Not a subtle drift, a sudden, sharp spin as if yanked by an invisible hand. The needle whirled, then wavered, then snapped toward a new direction, and stared, stunned. The man's eyes widened too, not because he believed in magic, but because he recognized the physics of proximity pull of magnets and metal, the tangible proof that something had changed because he was near. His voice came out as a whisper. It used to do that when I was close to the radio pack. His breath shuddered. She looked up, fully not, meeting him face to face. Time had altered him. Gray hair, lines carved deep, a thinness around the mouth that spoke of long-held pain. But the bones of the man were there, the shape of his eyes, the familiar restraint, like emotion was a dangerous thing he'd been trained to contain. Her lips moved, but her voice didn't come at first. She tried again. James, she said. The name hung in the autumn air like a note held too long. The man blinked hard, as if trying to clear water from his vision. His mouth quivered, one corner pulling upward in a smile that wasn't joy, exactly more like disbelief breaking open. How do you know? He began, then stopped. His throat worked. My name is James, he said finally, as if offering the only safe fact he could manage. James Carter. His knees went weak. Her hand flew to the wall for balance. The black stone caught her palm, cold and real. For a second she saw the cave again, rain, darkness, the taste of ration bread, the roar of rotors. Then she saw the present, an old man's face trembling with the effort of staying upright in a world that had just shifted. His eyes filled. Yule, she whispered the same words she had spoken in 1972. James' breath broke on a sound that was half laugh, half sob. He said, voice cracking. You're real. He stared at her as if she might vanish if he blinked, and reached slowly for the compass pendant, and held it out between them like a bridge. I kept it, she said, all these years. James' hand hovered near it, shaking. He did not touch it yet. His fingers flexed, uncertain, like a man afraid of breaking something sacred. I thought you were a dream, he whispered. I told my wife about you. Shesh believed me, but I never. His voice collapsed, and inhaled slowly, grounding herself. She did not rush him. She did not flood the moment with questions. The wall had taught her something. Grief doesn't like to be hurried. James looked past her suddenly, eyes flicking to the names on the stone. All these, he murmured, Bosra. All these bows. He swallowed hard and turned back to her. Why are you here? His answer came from a place deeper than strategy. To say goodbye, she said honestly, or to say thank you. I didn't know which. Jameis' eyes shone. He nodded once, as if he understood perfectly. Then, with a trembling exhale, he reached forward and finally touched the compass just the edge, barely, as if confirming it was solid. The needle inside shivered again, and in the reflection of the black stone, two old faces hovered side by side on from America, one from Vietnam both carrying the same war, both finally standing close enough for the past to stop being a distance and become a moment. Not an ending, a beginning, arriving late, but arriving all the same. They didn't embrace right away. That would have been the kind of moment movies rush toward, music swelling, arms wrapping tight, strangers crying on cue. Real life moved differently. Real life, especially after war, approached tenderness the way you approach a wound, slowly, respectfully, testing the edges. So they stood there in front of the black stone, the names behind them like a choir of the unsaid, and kept one hand lightly against the wall, as if the cold granite were the only thing keeping her from floating away. James kept his fingers on the compass pendant for a heartbeat longer than necessary, then let go as if afraid he'd taken too much. He cleared his throat. I didn't know you could do this, he said, gesturing vaguely toward the wall, toward Washington, toward a Vietnamese woman standing in his life like a miracle. His lips trembled into something that was almost a smile. Neither did I, she replied. His eyes flicked down to her hands. Your hands, they shaked. So do yours, and said gently. James looked at his own fingers, as if seeing them for the first time. The tremor wasn't dramatic, but it was therage, illness, nerves. He tried to curl his hand into a fist to hide it and failed. Bad timing, he muttered, the old medic's dark humor rising like a reflex. Finally meet the woman who saved my life, and I can't even. He stopped, embarrassed by emotion. His voice softened. Your timing is perfect. You are alive. They moved away from the wall together without deciding it out loud, their steps naturally aligning. He walked a little slower than she expected, as if each breath required negotiation. She adjusted her pace without making a show of it. That adjustment's more instinctive was the first act of care. They found a stone bench facing the reflection pool, the water dull under the autumn sky. Trees along the edge dropped leaves that spun in the wind like slow, golden cones. The air had that particular November bite that makes you pull your coat closer and feel strangely awake. For a while, they simply sat. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was full. James stared at the water. I came here every year after Ellen died, he said quietly. Didn't know why. Maybe I did. He swallowed, voice tightening. Some part of me kept coming back to the place where names are, where the truth is carved. Easier than my own house. And listened without interrupting. Her gaze stayed on his profile lines, the tiredness around his eyes, the way his jaw tightened when a memory rose too quickly. You were married, she said softly. James nodded. She was good. She was patient. He paused, then added, as if he needed her to know, I didn't stop remembering you. But it wasn't fair to live in the past with her. I tried to be here, with her. His chest ached, but not with jealousy, with understanding, to lives shaped by loyalty, both in different directions. I did not marry, and said. James turned, startled. Because of me? And looked down at her hands, the skin thin, veins visible. Because of a promise, she said, not spoken, but I carried it. I told myself I would find you, or at least know what happened to you. I did not want to give my life to someone while a part of my soul was still searching. James stared at her as if the words were too heavy to hold. I don't deserve that, he whispered. He met his eyes. Deserve has nothing to do with war, she said. We do what we can. We survive. Sometimes that is all. The wind shifted. A helicopter passed somewhere far off, small in the sky. James flinched. She borrowed a bit and saw it. She didn't comment. She simply let her hand rest near his on the bench, not touching yet, but close enough to say, I noticed. I'm here. James exhaled slowly. I've been sick, he admitted, words reluctant. BS helping, but he shrugged, the gesture small. I sold some things. Mimi wore box. Didn't think it mattered anymore. His eyes widened slightly. She understood instantly how that box had become a breadcrumb. How fate sometimes uses desperation as its messenger. My assistant found it, she said. In a shop. James let out a breath that sounded like disbelief turning into surrender. So the thing I let go of is what brought you back. He nodded once. Yes. They sat again in the quiet, watching ripples move across the pool. The world around them kept going. Tourist veterans, familiar for him and James, The day had become a pocket of time, sealed and sacred. Finally, James spoke with the bluntness of a man who has spent too long alone. What happens now? His answer was simple, because she had already lived through 30 years of complicated. Now she said, we drink tea, we eat, we talk, and we do not punish ourselves for time. James blinked. Tea, he repeated, almost amused. Smile deepened. Yes, tea, not war. James stared at her, then laughed quietly, surprised by his own sound. It was the first laugh that didn't carry bitterness. It sounded like the man he might have been without the jungle. He reached then, finally, and placed her hand over his. His fingers were cold. He didn't pull away. Instead, his hand turned slightly, and he held hers back, not tight, not possessive, just firm enough to be real. No words could improve that moment. They let it stand. Over the following months, their lives rearranged themselves with the careful tenderness of older people who know that time is not infinite. Used her resources to make James care easier, better specialists, safer housing, a routine that didn't humiliate him. She did it without treating him like a charity case. She spoke to him the way she spoke to everyone she respected directly. You will let them help, she told him once when he tried to refuse a home nurse. You are not in the jungle anymore. James' jaw clenched. I'm not a child. His eyes held his. No, she said. You are a man who carried too much alone. He stared at her, then looked away, blinking fast. Okay, he whispered. Okay. In return, James gave her something she had never allowed herself to want: companionship without performance. He sat with her in quiet rooms. He asked about her childhood. He listened to her stories of rebuilding a life in Vietnam, of fighting for respect in boardrooms full of men. He watched Vietnamese news with her and let her translate the emotional parts, not just the words. One evening, as they sat in her apartment near Arlington, she took out the compass and placed it in his palm. Do you want it back? She asked. James looked down at it for a long time. Then he shook his head. It's yours, he said. It's been yours longer than it was ever mine. He closed her fingers around it gently. Besides, it did its job. It brought you here. By spring, they had begun planning something together at a grand monument, not a performance for the world, but a quiet act of repair, a scholarship fund. In Vietnam, for students in nursing and medicine, especially those from rural provinces, especially those who had lost family to wars-long shadow, poverty, illness, displacement. They named it with both their names because healing, they agreed, should never belong to only one side. On the day the papers were signed, I looked at James and said, half teasing, half serious, now we create something that lives longer than our pain. James nodded, as what? That's what medics do, he said. We try to keep something alive. In late autumn, again on a year after they met at the wall, they returned to the memorial. The air was cold, and leaves skittered across the walkway. James walked more slowly now, leaning lightly on a cane, and stayed close, not hovering, just present. They stood before the black granite. Their reflections appeared again, older, softer, unmistakably together. James took a long breath. I used to think the war took everything, he said, and looked at him. It took much, she agreed. James turned his face toward hers. But it didn't take this. His hand found his. Their fingers interlaced. No, she said quietly. It did not. They sat on the bench one last time that day, facing the reflection pool. The compass rested against his chest. James' metals glinted faintly. The needle inside the compass stayed restless for a moment, then settled. Not because the world had finally become simple, but because, after 54 years, two survivors had finally stood close enough to let the past stop being a distant sheen, become a shared, quiet present. And in that quiet, love did what politics never could. It crossed the border. This story does not tell us that time heals everything. It tells us something truer and harder to accept. Time does not heal by itself. People do, when they choose not to let bitterness be the last word. James and lost half a century to history, borders, fear, paperwork, illness, and silence. They did not get youth back. They did not get the life that might have been. What they received instead was something rarer, the chance to finish a sentence that war interrupted. Their love was not loud. It did not arrive with promises of forever or dreams of starting over. It arrived with tea, with patience, with medical appointments and shared silences, with hands that shook but still reach. And that may be the deepest truth of all. Love is not proven by how long it lasts, but by how faithfully it waits. He did not wait because she was weak. James did not survive because he was fearless. They endured because somewhere inside them, each believed that kindness across enemy lines mattered, that one human act could outlive uniforms, ideologies, and decades of separation. This story reminds us that gratitude can become love when it is carried with care. Healing does not mean forgetting, it means choosing what we do with what we remember. It is never too late to arrive at meaning, even if you arrive tired, scarred, and gray-haired. And perhaps most importantly, life still has something to offer you even after the chapters we thought defined us are over. Questions for you, our listeners: is there someone from your past, a person, a moment, a promise you never truly said goodbye to? Have you ever carried gratitude, regret, or love silently for years? And sure, if it still had a place in your life, what would it mean for you to stop waiting for time to heal and instead choose a small act of courage or connection today? If this story touched something in you, we invite you to share. Your story does not have to be dramatic. It only has to be true. You can leave a comment or send your story privately to the email pinned in the description. With your permission, your experience may help someone else feel less alone, because healing is never a solo journey. And sometimes the most powerful love stories don't begin with hope, they begin with survival.